This is Sandance, a system for visually exploring your data, finding insights, and communicating those insights to others. I'm going to start off with a simple demo set. This is actually some demographic data mashed up with some recent election data. We've got about 25,000 items here, and right now they're all laid out in a flat way where you don't have any insights. Each of these squares is shown on a screen, and each square represents a county, or actually a census-designated place. So when we select them, you can actually see what's in each county. You can see there's the name, the education level, the median income level, the latitude and longitude. But again, without actually laying them out in a more interesting way, you can't see anything about this data. One of the things I can do is I can switch to a scatter plot, and now structure starts to emerge. You see a map of the United States. It's not really a map, it's really just a scatter plot of longitude versus latitude. But we're so familiar with the outlines of the United States that we can actually start to see some structure. I can switch this to a column plot, and now we see the sand, or these little pieces, pouring down into each of these buckets, counting them up. So you see that there are fewer things over here because in that region of the United States, it's fairly sparsely populated with lots of deserts and mountain places. Again, switch it, you can actually see that counting. Out here, there's also fewer places. Now, why is that? The East Coast is fairly densely populated. Well, that's because New England sticks out a fair amount. So we're already seeing some structure here, but it's a lot more interesting when you start mapping colors onto this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to color by the recent election, or at least the Obama election. And I'm actually going to choose a custom color palette where we're just looking at red versus blue to start with. So in this red versus blue, you're seeing that it's not at the state level, it's at this county level. So there's a lot more nuances already. You're seeing Florida, for instance, having some blue along the coast, some red, some blue, red. You can actually see why that was such a swing state. You're seeing Texas having more blue than I expected. You're seeing these spots of California there. Again, if I were to switch to a column plot, you can see that like New England is almost entirely blue, and you can see the striations for Southern California and on up as we've kept the order constant. But you saw a glimpse of this before. If we actually choose a color palette that's actually more continuous, you see that it's much more nuanced than simply red state versus blue state. You're seeing lots of white here. White is now representing all these swing counties. If I click on them, I can select all the swing counties. You can see that they're all over the country. I can actually even separate this out into 9 different maps of the United States. So essentially, we've faceted this by Obama. Here are all those swing counties. Here are the counties that went deeply for Romney, and here are the counties that went deeply for Obama. And you can see, what might be a place out here. We can actually select some of these and see information about them. So who went deeply for Romney? When I pull that out, you can see it's the state of Utah. And in fact, if we click on the state of Utah, it actually will select all the places in Utah, no matter where they were. And there was actually some swing counties in Utah, but nowhere in Utah did it actually end up going for Obama. So let's turn off the faceting, and I'm going to save this as an insight because I think this is an interesting insight for later on. So I can just open up the insight panel, I can add this, and now we have an insight that we can come back to, maybe share all the insights together. So turn that off, and now we want to kind of delve down to, maybe it's clearly not red state versus blue state, maybe it's about population density that might be a better notion of which way someone might be voting. So I'm going to switch to a stacked view. This is a 3D view, and I'm going to actually switch this to about 50 bins, and this to be about 30 bins. And now we're starting to see some structure emerging here. I'll sort this by the color, and you can see that as I rotate around this thing, you can see that here during these flat places where there's not a lot of places close together, it's very red. But in those places where there are a lot of them, it seems to be going a little bit more towards the blue. So maybe it's about population density, and that's a pretty good clue to that. So let's switch back to a scatter plot here. And another view that will make that even more apparent is what's classically known as a tree map. So here what we've done is we've actually just laid them out. I'm going to actually scale them based upon the total population, and now we can see that the biggest populations were fairly blue, And we can actually name these places. We can pull out the names and find out where they were. This is New York City, LA, Chicago, Houston, and it's not until we get to Phoenix that we finally got one population center that's red, and then you have to go all the way down to Fort Worth to get the next one. So it's clearly seeing that a lot of the population centers seem to go more blue than red. So I'm going to go back and go back to this insight that we saved before and look at something other than the politics. We're going to look at income across the country. So I can switch this to income levels. And here now red represents low income and blue represents high income. And you're going, I don't see a lot of blue here. You know, there is blue scattered about, but mostly now things like LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, but you know, across the country it's looking pretty red. And in fact, if we view this as a column chart, in each one of these you can see a little bit of these blues. But again, if we sort by color, you can see that there's only a thin strip of blue in each of those longitudinal areas. We can switch this to income, and now we're looking at all the low income down here and all the higher income up here. And you can see that most of the country is below and fairly low income. Okay? Poverty level is around 26K, and all of these counties are living with a median income below the poverty level. So let's delve down into this a little bit more deeply. Let's see what correlates with that. So I can switch this to a scatter plot. And one thing that we'll kind of logically look at is unemployment. Now, pretty much it makes sense that higher income means lower unemployment. It's this sort of curve that goes like that. And that makes sense. Affluent counties don't have that much unemployment. It's interesting if we change this to education, though, we get exactly that same curve. The higher the education in general, the lower unemployment. That's pretty interesting. But we're also looking at color. We're looking at color meaning income. So again, the higher you go, in general, the bluer it gets. Except for a couple weird outliers. Here's a spot here that's got a lot of education, and by education we mean 95.6% of the people in this place have a bachelor's degree or higher. But they're not making much money according to this graph. They're only around there. So where is a place like this that has fairly high education and very low income? Well, let's take a look. Turns out that it's Stanford, California, where the median age is 23. These are students living on a student stipend, maybe working on their higher degrees and not making much money. Well, one point doesn't a pattern make, but here's another point. Let's take a look at that. That's Tompkins County, Forest Home. Where is Tompkins County? Well, I can click on it and just look it up in Bing and find out that that's the home of Cornell. So now I'm starting to see a pattern. If I switch this to income, again, the further education you have, more education you have, the further up you go on the income ladder, except these places down here. And if I actually select all those places down here, let's take a look. Turns out that there's Stanford again. That's where Emory University is. That's where Dartmouth is. Cornell, more Cornell, and we also have Swarthmore. So essentially, these are all college towns, high education and low income. Every single one of them is a college town. Now that's just interesting to kind of reveal patterns. Let's go back to our latitude and longitude and look at some other ways that patterns can be revealed. So one way is with search. So I don't know if you know how the zip codes are laid out across the country. I'll pull up the keyboard here. Notice everything's being done by touch, and we can use a touch or a mouse or a small laptop screen or a big screen like this PPI. I'm going to search for all the zip codes that start with a 9. You can see those are all over here. Well, what about all those that start with 8? Those are all over here. And a couple weird ones over there. And I'm going, this doesn't really look right. Let's go to like the 2s. Ah, okay. Now I start to understand what's going on, because I grew up in the 21208 area, and I went to school in the 02140 area. And it's like, oh, it starts with a 0. So what actually happened here is when I was cleaning and preparing this data, at one point I started treating zip codes as numbers. And that means that you can strip off the leading 0. You don't say $0, you say $30. And just like you don't say 2124, you say 02124 for where you might live. So I made an error. And this is actually important to be able to see those errors, because if you're doing some sort of machine learning model based upon this, you might not ever notice that mistake until it's too late and you start getting things that don't make sense. So I'm going to go back to the 9s and go back to the 9/8s, and now we're just focusing on Western Washington there. I'm just going to isolate Western Washington here. Get rid of this keyboard. And now you can see this spot of Western Washington that's got high income there. Well, let's see where that is. Turns out that's Medina. That's where Bill Gates lives. And that kind of makes sense, especially if we look at the median home values here. You can see that Bill Gates is living in the spot with the highest median home value across the country, or at least in this area. And in fact, it's kind of surprising. It's only about $1 million. I figured Bill Gates would be living in a more affluent neighborhood than that. But if we pull in the rest of the day, we can see everything's capped at $1 million, because the census only goes up to $1 million or more. So let's take a look at another data set to show you. This is the data set of the Titanic survivors. Now every point here is representing a person that was on the Titanic. Let's actually explore and see whether the age-old adage of women and children first was actually followed when they were going to the lifeboats. So here are all the women, here are all the men, and one of the things we can do is we can color it by whether they survived or not. So here, color by survive. And I'm going to choose a palette that makes it a little bit easier to remember that. So I kind of like to use red versus green just to show when they survived. And it helps to have red being died and green being survived. So now you can see that most of the women survived. Sort again by color. And you can see that if we just selected the survivors and just isolated those, you can see about the same number of women as men survived. But as a percentage, you can see that the women did much better. But that's still not the whole story. If we now look at this by cabin class, you can see first class, second class, third class in the crew, where there were clearly a lot of people in the crew, and a lot of men in the crew that did not survive. So I'm actually just going to throw the crew out of this and just look at the passengers. And you can see that for just the passengers in first class, only about 6 women didn't survive. And only about 13 or 14 women in second class didn't survive. But in third class, more than half of the women didn't survive. So it helped to be female and rich to survive the Titanic. Well, what about children? Let's look at the age of children. Turns out, similar pattern. In first and second class, there's only 1 person that didn't survive. But in third class, more than half of the kids did not survive. It's kind of interesting. We can actually take a look at this point over here and see who this person is. Turns out it's Miss Helen Lorraine Allison, and if we look her up, there's an entry about her in the Encyclopedia Titanica, and we can find out that she was traveling with her mother and father and brother, and they were separated, and they vowed not to leave without the others, and they were last seen together smiling on the promenade deck. And so it's nice to be able to help associate real people with these data points. One last thing that you might kind of be able to have a story in this, let's take off fasting by class, and let's look at the Titanic by how much the tickets cost. So now I'm going to color this by cabin class. And I'm going to do this. And let's choose a nice qualitative color thing so we can see this well. And I like this one better. So you can see that first class is red, second class is blue, and third class is green, which means they paid a lot less money, and they're all over here. Except for this one outlier. Again, the outliers tend to be what's really interesting to me. Who is this person that didn't pay much money, but ended up in first class? Turns out it's Mr. Franz Olaf Carlson. Again, we can look them up. Turns out that he was essentially got his captain's papers. He was first mate on a ship, but there was a strike. So the company gave him a first-class ticket back to New York on the Titanic, but he did not survive the sinking. So he was a doubly unlucky person. So again, this is all about seeing these insights, finding these insights, and communicating these insights. And it's really remarkably easy to use. Thanks.